out that this destruction of the temple isn't an immediate thing either. It's a generation away. You know, we're
almost 40 years.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a little bit problematic in that we stop and think the Lord's saying the generation in which these things are shown forth shall be the generation where the end is the end is coming. But we have an entire generation before the end comes. Most of the people who confronted Jesus that day may not be there 40 years later. So why the destruction then 40 years later? And it is interesting to me that when Pilate pleads for the Savior's life, the response of the Jews is,
"The blood be upon our children."
Us and our children. And that's exactly the generation where that blood came upon us and our children. It's horrible to curse our children. But I do believe that the Lord reached out and got that entire generation, as the Jews oathed, and pulled all of them in. It is interesting that now as Jesus begins to answer the questions, he answers question 1, when is the destruction of the temple and the Jews? And
for me, that's the great value of Joseph Smith Matthew, is because of the prophetic rearrangement of verses, because of the little insights added. He's answering these questions as they were asked. It's not hit and miss. Well, we skip around and we answer part of this question, and then we go back and try to get the second question and come back to the first question. It really is much clearer in Joseph Smith Matthew.
Even when you repeat some of the very same verses verbatim, it's saying that those things will happen in both to answer both questions in both time periods. But it makes it very clear that they're happening twice rather than going back and forth.
Verse 20?
Yeah.
That's the cutoff point?
Well, in fact, you could even go to the end of the first phrase in verse 21. Behold, these things I have spoken unto you concerning the Jews. End of the answer to the first question.
Now let's talk about a day yet future.
And then the second question he begins to answer in 21, and again after the tribulation of those days which will come upon Jerusalem, etc., etc., etc. So we get the answer to the second question in the second half of 21 and following.
Well, it's interesting the way he uses that phrase more than once, and again.
That's right.
And again.
That's right.
Talking about this, what do we call it, pattern prophecy.
Yeah, and the thing we need to understand, too, is when we get pattern prophecy of this kind, when you get this pattern flowing, you get this consequence coming out as well. So as we take a look at what happens then in the forepart, it gives us understanding into why things move the way they do in the second part.
And how real, how specific they are prophesied, and the fulfillment is exactly as they are prophesied. If we can look back and see that in the former day, it gives us...
Well, let's just take a look. I don't know that we need to read this, but let's just take a look at some of the things Jesus prophesies that are fulfilled by 70 A.D. The first thing he prophesies is conditions within the church itself. This is pretty scary prophecy. There will arise false Christs, and what will these false Christs do? They will deliver you, they will kill you, you will be hated of all nations, then they will turn on one another, they will betray one another. This is pretty gloom and doom for the church
but
itself.
they'll also deceive you.
Yes.
Deceive many, excuse me. They will deceive many of the Jewish people.
Well, and if you consider what did, as Josephus describes, that horrible scene that's taking place between 66 and 70, and the number of persons who rise up in the prophetic role, and instead of telling them, as Jesus had, get out of town, they're telling them, come to town.
Exactly right.
And so they're sending them exactly the wrong direction, and the people are following them.
And I think we need to stress here that the Lord does emphasize the fact that when you see these signs, particularly the signs spoken of by Daniel, and I take it Jesus there means pagan troops moving against the holy house, get out, get up, go, don't pack anything other than the bare necessities, leave because it is now. And then verse 18, for then in those days shall be great tribulation on the Jews and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem, such as was not before sent upon Israel of God since the beginning of their kingdom. That considering how dark the history of the Jews is, that is an extremely bleak prophecy.
Well, and surely that phrase, abomination of desolation, must have rung in their minds, because, I mean, what would they think back on in Jesus' day? They would have thought back on the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, right? When there was desecration of the holy house. And so Jesus predicting the same thing here.
Or they may even have referred back to the first destruction of the temple in 586.
There's
when there were several deportations, and there was also destruction of the Jews and the families of the Jewish people.
Yeah, there's no question that this is ugly. This prophecy must have really hit them, and hit them hard. The Lord then, once he shows what is going to happen, having warned his disciples, is now ready to move to the second part of the prophecy. But I don't believe we can leave this part of the prophecy until we understand that the Christians believed and remembered. And therefore, Eusebius tells us in the ecclesiastical history of the church that when the first Roman advance against the city of Jerusalem took place in 66, and then Galacestius pulled his troops out, that the Jewish false Messiah says this is the sign that we can throw off the Roman yoke. The Christian prophet said this is the sign, and pulled the people out of Jerusalem and moved them to Pella across Jordan, so that they were secured from the horrible 3-year siege that then took. Josephus estimates 600,000 Jewish lives at that time. It is interesting. It all came apart.
Christian. They were gone.
They were gone. They listened to their prophets. They were prepared. They remember the words of Jesus, and therefore the calamity that struck Judea so hard left the church essentially unscathed. They were where they were supposed to be, and they were secure. Now, having said that, all of which is history, it's part of our past. Admittedly, it was prophecy when it was spoken here, but it's now part of our history. We can see how literally it was fulfilled. We can move now to the second portion and just simply take a look at what's going to happen next. And I feel these next verses are critical. I would like to take them one at a time and just have us comment on what's going on here, beginning with 23. Joseph, would you be our
Could I back us up and just look at verse 22?
Okay.
Because the Savior says, "For in those days," meaning the days following the destruction, I think, of 70 A.D. Could we agree to that?
Yes.
"For in those days there shall also arise false Christs." In other words, this is a repeat of what has happened in the days before 70. Now we get rising other false Christs and false prophets. And from a standpoint of Jewish history, that's absolutely true. There's no question it was fulfilled. All you need to do is look at the second Jewish revolt, which happened in 135 A.D., and we have one of the most notable prophets, Bar Kokhba, rising up, and he is even declared to be the Messiah by the leading rabbis of the day. So all of these things really are being fulfilled in remarkable fashion after the destruction of 70.
This can apply equally to our day.
Well, to the end of the 20th century, for that matter.
Absolutely.
In fact, you think about what a false Christ is. In our day, with the exception of a few deluded individuals who may claim to be Jesus, we're really not talking about individuals. We're talking about a false system of salvation. We're talking about a false belief, a false practice, anything that would lead a person away from the service of the true and living God. Somebody who promises salvation on a wrong and improper foundation.
Yeah. Sure. Joseph, would you read for us, please?
Commencing with 23.
Please, yes.
Behold, I speak these things unto you for the elect's sake, and you also shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all I have told you must come to pass, but the end is not yet.
He's talking to two groups of people. Now, the thing that struck me some time ago when I read that is he is on the Mount with people who have been purged. I mean, these are the truest of the true. They have been with him through all. And then he says, I speak these things unto you for the elect's sake. If these people aren't elect, then who is the elect? And of course, the answer to that, I think, is found in D&C 29, and that is?
Those who harden not their hearts and who hear my voice.
Exactly right.